The envelope came on a Tuesday. I remember because Tuesdays are when I water the orchids on the back porch, and I had soil under my fingernails when the mail truck pulled away. The return address was a law firm in downtown Bend, Pendergast and Vance. It said, in those raised gold letters lawyers love so much. I sat down on the top step, still holding my watering can, and I opened it. It was my daughter's name on the petition. My only child. Petitioner, Wendy Marsh Cantor versus Respondent, Harriet Marsh. I'm Harriet. I'm 72 years old. I worked 38 years as a charge nurse on the pediatric floor at St. Vincent's, and I raised that girl alone after her father died of an aneurysm in the produce aisle of a Safeway in 1991. She was 9. I don't tell you that for sympathy. I tell you that so you understand what it felt like to read the words, Petition for Civil Trespass and Elder Harassment, with my daughter's signature underneath. I read it 3 times. I thought maybe my eyes were going. They aren't. The cataracts came out clean 2 summers ago. The petition said I had entered her home without permission on the evening of September 14th, that I had removed her minor child from the residence without consent, and that I had engaged in a pattern of intrusive behavior over the past 18 months. It asked for a no-contact order, monetary damages of $15,000, and supervised-only visitation with my grandson. My grandson is 6. His name is Beau. On September 14th, he had a fever of 104.2, and he was alone in that house for almost 5 hours. But I'm getting ahead of myself. Let me back up. When my husband died, Wendy and I had $92 in checking. The life insurance was a term policy that had lapsed because we'd been a month behind. I picked up an extra night shift, then another, then I started doing weekend home care visits for an agency that paid in cash. There was a stretch, maybe 2 years, where I slept in 3-hour pieces. I'd come home at 6 in the morning, pack her lunch, sit on the edge of her bed and stroke her hair until she woke up. She'd ask if I had to go back. I'd say not until tonight, sweetheart. Then I'd lie down on the couch in my scrubs and sleep until she got home from school. I tell you this because Wendy doesn't remember it that way. She remembers the empty house. She remembers the babysitter, Mrs. Pello, who watched cooking shows with the volume too loud. She remembers being the only kid at the school recital whose parent wasn't in the audience. I remember those things too. I remember every one of them, Lord, I do. But I remember them as the cost of keeping her clothed and fed and in that little white house on Juniper Street. And she remembers them as the years her mother wasn't there. You can love someone deeply and still have them hand you a bill for it later. I learned that. She married a man named Trent Cantor when she was 26. He's a litigator, specializes in real estate disputes. He's the kind of man who corrects your grammar at Thanksgiving dinner and then laughs to show he's only joking. I never warmed to him, but I tried. Lord knows I tried. When Beau was born, I drove to the hospital with a casserole and a hand-knit blanket the color of butter. Trent met me at the door of the maternity room and told me Wendy was tired. He took the blanket. He did not let me in. That was the first time I should have said something. I didn't. Things settled. After, they moved into a tall, narrow house in a development called Aspen Ridge, the kind of place where the lawns are all exactly the same shade of green and the mailboxes match. Wendy invited me for Sunday dinners now and then. I always brought something. A pie. A jar of the strawberry jam I make from the Hood River berries. Beau called me Gigi from the time he could talk, and from the first time he wrapped his little hand around my finger, I was a goner. I was hers and his, and that was that. I babysat when they asked. I drove him to swimming lessons when their schedules got tight. I sat in the cold parents' lounge at the YMCA reading magazines and waving at him through the glass. He pressed his face to the window with his goggles still on, and his lips would go fish-shaped, and I'd laugh until my eyes watered. There is a particular ache to grandmother love that I cannot put into words for you. It is your child's child. It is everything you survived, walking around in a small body, holding a juice box. The trouble started about 1.5 years ago. Wendy got promoted to regional manager at the cosmetics company where she works. More travel, more late nights. Trent's caseload got heavier. They started forgetting things. Picking Beau up from kindergarten, signing the field trip slip, sending him to school in shoes a size too small. I notice because I'm a nurse. You don't stop being a nurse just because you retire. I noticed his nails were dirty. I noticed he had the same scab on his elbow for 3 weeks because nobody was reminding him to leave it alone. I noticed he flinched when grown-ups raised their voices. Even on television, I started bringing groceries, not a lot. A bag of apples, some yogurt cups, the kind of crackers he liked. I'd leave them on the counter and let myself out. I had a key. Wendy had given it to me herself when Beau was a baby, in case of emergency. The first phone call came in March. Wendy said, "Mom, we appreciate the help, but Trent and I would prefer if you called before coming over." I said, "Of course, sweetheart, of course." The second call came in May. She said, "Mom, we need you to give the key back." I gave it back. I drove it over in an envelope and slid it through the mail slot. The third call came in July, after I went to Beau's t-ball game. I had not told them I was coming. I sat 3 rows back by myself and I cheered when he got a hit. After the game, Trent came over to the bleachers and said very calmly, "Harriet, this isn't appropriate. You weren't invited." I said it was a public park, Trent. He said, "We need you to respect our boundaries." I drove home and sat in my car in the driveway for 40 minutes before I could go inside. I called my friend Benita, who I worked with at St. Vincent's for 22 years and who is the closest thing I have to a sister. I told her what he said. She was quiet for a long time. Then she said, "Honey, they're squeezing you out." I didn't believe her. I should have. The cease and desist came in August, 2 single-spaced pages on Trent's firm's letterhead. It listed every visit, every phone call, every text message I'd sent in the previous 6 months. It used phrases like unsolicited contact and boundary violations and unwelcome contributions. It said if I came to their property again without express written permission, they would seek legal remedy. I read that letter and I went into my bathroom and I threw up. I am not a dramatic person. I have watched children die. I have held mothers while they screamed. I do not throw up over paper. But that letter went into me like a knife, and I could not keep it down. I called Wendy. She didn't answer. I left a message. She didn't call back. I sat in my house for 3 weeks. I did not call. I did not visit. I did not send so much as a birthday card to Beau, whose birthday is the 29th of August, because I did not know if a card would count as contact. I cried at night. I stopped eating breakfast. Benita brought me a pot roast and made me eat half of it sitting at her kitchen table while she watched me like I was one of our patients. Then came September 14th. It was a Saturday. Around 4 in the afternoon, the phone rang, and when I picked it up, I heard breathing, ragged and small, and a little voice said, "Gigi?" It was Beau. I said, "Baby, what's wrong? Where's your mama?" He said, "Mama and Daddy went to a wedding. The lady was supposed to come, but she didn't come. And I'm hot, Gigi, I'm really hot, and I throwed up on the rug." Listen to me. I want you to hear this. I am a retired pediatric nurse. I have worked 38 years on a children's floor. When a 6-year-old tells you he threw up and he's hot, you do not stop to consult a lawyer. You do not draft an email. You get in the car. I got in the car. The drive to Aspen Ridge is 22 minutes. I made it in 14. I do not remember the route. I remember my hands on the wheel and the sound of my own breathing. I remember thinking, please God, please God, please God, the way I used to pray when we'd get a kid in respiratory distress. The front door was unlocked. I walked in and called his name. He came down the stairs in his Spider-Man pajamas, his cheeks flushed cherry red, and he held up his arms. I picked him up. He was burning. I knew before I checked. 104.2, said the thermometer in their bathroom. His pulse was racing. He was lethargic. He hadn't eaten since lunch. There was vomit on the carpet upstairs and on the front of his pajama shirt. I called Wendy. Voicemail. I called Trent. Voicemail. I called Wendy again. Voicemail. I called Wendy again. Voicemail. I packed Bo into my car with a blanket and a sippy cup of water, and I drove him to the urgent care on Greenwood Avenue. The doctor there, a young woman with kind eyes, took one look at him and said, "How long has he been like this?" I said I didn't know. She said, "Where are his parents?" I said I didn't know that either. She asked me to step out so she could examine him. When she came back, she sat across from me in one of those plastic waiting room chairs and she said, "Mrs. Marsh, I need to ask you some questions." It was a viral infection. He needed fluids and Tylenol and a quiet room. He was going to be fine, but the doctor wrote everything down. The fever, the time elapsed, the fact that he'd been alone, the vomit, the unanswered calls. She wrote it all down. I didn't know then that she was a mandated reporter. Wendy called me back at 7:45 that evening. By then I had Bo home, in his own bed, with a cool washcloth on his forehead and Tylenol working through his system. She said, "Mom, where is my son?" I said, "He's at home, sweetheart. He was very sick. I took him to urgent care." There was a silence on the line that I will remember until I die. Then she said, "You took him without permission. You took my child without my permission." I said, "Wendy, he was alone. He had a fever of 104. The babysitter never came." She said, "We hired someone. She must have been delayed. You had no right." I said, "I'm his grandmother." She said, "You are not his guardian." She was at the house in 20 minutes. Trent was with her. I had Bo wrapped in his quilt on the couch, watching cartoons with the volume low. He sat up when he saw them and he said, "Mama, Gigi made me toast." Wendy did not look at me. She picked him up and she carried him upstairs. Trent stood in the foyer in his good gray suit with the tie loosened and he said, "You need to leave." I left. The petition came 9 days later. I called a lawyer the next morning. A woman named Frances Okafor, recommended by Bonita's son-in-law who works in family law in Portland. Frances is in her 50s with cropped silver hair and reading glasses on a beaded chain. She read the petition while I sat across from her drinking the worst coffee I have ever had in my life. When she finished, she took her glasses off and she looked at me and she said, "Mrs. Marsh, tell me everything." I did. I told her about Wendy as a little girl. I told her about Trent. I told her about the cease and desist, the t-ball game, the groceries on the counter. I told her about September 14th. I told her about the doctor at urgent care. She wrote things down. When I was done, she said, "I want to subpoena that medical record." I said, "Will it help?" She said, "Mrs. Mine Marsh, that medical record is going to do most of our work for us. I want to tell you something here. I want to tell you about the weeks between that meeting and the hearing. I did not sleep well. I lost 8 pounds. I could not afford to lose. I stood in my kitchen one night at 3 in the morning eating cold pot roast straight out of the Tupperware because I had not eaten in 2 days, and Bonita would have killed me if I let myself faint. I prayed. I am not the praying kind, not really, but I prayed. I am not the praying kind, not really, but I prayed. I also did one other thing. I wrote letters to Bo. I knew I could not send them. I knew that if I tried, it would be used against me. So I bought a leather-bound journal at the drugstore, and I wrote him letters in it. I wrote him a letter about the day he was born and how his hand fit around my finger. I wrote him a letter about the time we made strawberry jam together and he licked the spoon and made a face like he'd seen the face of God. I wrote him a letter explaining what I was doing and why, and that none of it was his fault, and that no matter what happened in court, I would love him from wherever I was for as long as I drew breath. I numbered them. I got to 43 before the hearing. The hearing was on a Wednesday morning in October. Courtroom 3B in the Deschutes County Courthouse. The judge was a woman named Honorable Patrice Yardley, who was, I would learn, the longest-serving judge in that courthouse and a grandmother of 7. Wendy and Trent sat at the petitioner's table. Wendy did not look at me. Not once, that whole morning. Trent did. He looked at me with the kind of polite contempt you give a stranger who is cut in line at the grocery store. Trent's lawyer went first. He was a young man in an expensive suit. He talked about boundaries. He talked about parental authority. He talked about my pattern of intrusive behavior. He read excerpts from text messages I had sent, taken out of context, that made me sound like a woman who would not let go. He played a voicemail I had left on Wendy's phone in May, my voice cracking, asking her please, could I just see Bo for an hour? He made me sound desperate. I was desperate. He was not wrong about that. Frances went second. She was calm. She did not raise her voice. She started with my employment record at St. Vincent's. 38 years, 3 commendations for excellence in pediatric care. Then she walked through the timeline. Then she put the urgent care doctor on the stand. The doctor's name was Dr. May Lin. She wore a simple cardigan over her scrubs. She testified that on September 14th at approximately 5:15 p.m., I had brought my grandson into urgent care with a fever of 104.2 degrees, signs of dehydration, and emesis. She testified that the child had been alone in the home for an indeterminate period exceeding 4 hours per the grandmother's account. She testified that she had filed a mandated report with the Oregon Department of Human Services that same evening. The whole courtroom went still. I watched Wendy's face go white. Frances asked Dr. Lin one more question. She asked, in your professional opinion, if Mrs. Marsh had not removed the child from the home and brought him in for medical care, what was the likely outcome? Dr. Lin paused. Then she said, with a fever that high in a 6-year-old with no adult supervision and active vomiting, the risk of febrile seizure or aspiration was significant. Mrs. Marsh's intervention very likely prevented a serious medical event. Wendy made a sound. It was not a word. It was a sound I had not heard her make since she was a small girl waking up from a nightmare. I wanted to go to her. The bailiff would have stopped me. I sat on my hands. Trent's lawyer tried to recover. He asked Dr. Lin whether it was standard practice to remove a child from a parent's home without consent. Dr. Lin said it was standard practice for any reasonable adult to seek emergency care for a febrile child, and that she would have made the same recommendation to anyone in the same situation. Then Frances called me to the stand. She asked me simple questions. How long have you been a nurse? How often did you see your grandson before this dispute began? What was your relationship with him like? I answered. My voice did not shake, which surprised me. Then she asked, Mrs. Marsh, why did you not call your daughter before going to the house on September 14th? I said, I did call her. Twice. She didn't answer, and my grandson was on the phone telling me he was sick. She asked, why did you not call 911? I said, I'm a pediatric nurse. I've triaged 1,000 kids his age. I assessed the situation and made the call I would make for any child in my care. I went to him. The judge was watching me very closely. I saw her write something down. Trent's lawyer cross-examined me. He tried to get me to admit I had a pattern of overstepping. He brought up the t-ball game. He brought up the groceries. I said, yes. I went to my grandson's t-ball game. Yes, I bought him groceries. I am his grandmother. I will not apologize for either. He said, even after you were asked to stop? I said, I stopped going to their house when they asked. I gave back the key. I did not go to that house from August 2nd until September 14th, when my grandson called me sick and alone. I would do that again tomorrow. I would do that again for any child. I sat down. My knees were not entirely steady, but I sat down without staggering, which felt like a victory. The judge asked if there was anything else. Francis said no. Trent's lawyer said no. Then the judge took her glasses off. She set them down on the bench. She looked at Wendy and Trent for a long moment, and then she looked at me, and then she looked at the courtroom, and she said, "I have been on this bench for 26 years. In that time, I have heard cases that involved actual abuse, actual neglect, actual harm done to children by people who claim to love them. I have removed children from homes. I have terminated parental rights. I take petitions of this kind seriously because the integrity of a family unit is something this court is bound to protect." She paused. "What I will not do," she said, "is allow this courtroom to be used as an instrument of family conflict against a woman who, by every credible piece of evidence before me, took the only reasonable action available to her to protect a sick child. The petition before me alleges trespass and harassment. The evidence before me describes a grandmother who answered a phone call from a feverish 6-year-old whose parents were unreachable, drove him to receive medical care, and returned him to his home. That is not trespass. That is not harassment. That is, in the plainest possible terms, the action of a competent, loving adult." Trent was shaking his head. The judge saw it. "Mr. Cantor," she said, "I am speaking. You will listen." He stopped shaking his head. "This petition is denied," she said. "The request for a no-contact order is denied. The request for damages is denied. The request for supervised visitation is denied. Furthermore, this court is in receipt of a referral from the Oregon Department of Human Services regarding the events of September 14th, and that matter will proceed independently of this proceeding. I would advise both petitioners to consult with their attorney about cooperating fully with that investigation." She paused again. She looked directly at Wendy. "Mrs. Cantor," she said, "your mother is not your enemy. Whatever grievances exist between you are not the business of this court. But I will say this. Off the record, and as a private observation, there will come a day, ma'am, when you are old and your son is grown, and you will understand what it costs to be the woman your mother is. I hope on that day you have the grace to remember this morning." She brought down her gavel. Wendy was crying. Not loud. Just tears running down her face while she sat very still. Trent put his hand on her back. She moved away from him. I walked out of that courtroom and I did not look back. Frances drove me home. I asked her if I could see Bo now. She said legally, yes. Practically, I should give it a few days, let the dust settle. I said all right. I sat in my kitchen that night, and I made myself a cup of tea and I ate a piece of toast with butter, and that was the most food I had eaten in one sitting in 2 months. Wendy called me 3 days later. I almost didn't pick up. I picked up. She said, "Mom." I said, yes. She was crying. She said, "Mom, I'm so sorry. I'm so sorry. I'm so sorry." I let her cry. I did not say it was all right because it was not all right. It would not be all right for a long time. Some of it might never be all right. But I said, "I love you, Wendy. I have always loved you." She said, "Trent moved out yesterday." I said, "Oh, sweetheart." She said, "He doesn't think we should fight the DHAS thing. He says it's better to settle." Mom, I don't know what I'm doing. I don't know how I let this happen. I said, "You can come over. Bring Bo. I'll make grilled cheese." She came. She brought him. He saw me through the screen door and he ran. He ran like only a 6-year-old can, all knees and elbows, and he hit me at full speed with his arms around my waist. Then he said, "Gigi, Gigi, Gigi." I held my grandson in my front hallway, and over the top of his head, I looked at my daughter, who was standing on the porch with her hands over her face, and I said, "Come inside, sweetheart. The grilled cheese is waiting. We are not fixed. We will not be fixed for a long time." There is a DHS social worker named Andrea who comes to Wendy's house every 2 weeks and asks questions and writes things down. There are conversations Wendy and I are going to have. Hard ones, about what she remembers from her childhood and what I remember and where those things meet and where they don't. But every Sunday now, Bo and I make jam. We use the strawberries from the farmer's market on Galveston Avenue, and he stands on a step stool next to the stove with a wooden spoon, and he asks me questions. Last Sunday, he asked me what it was like when I was 6. I told him I had a yellow dog named Buster and a treehouse my father built me. He said, "Did you have a Gigi?" I said, "I did." He said, "Was she nice like you?" I said, "I hope I am as nice as she was." I still have the journal, 43 letters, plus the ones I've written since. I'm going to give it to him on his 18th birthday. He'll be old enough to understand it then. Or maybe he won't. Maybe nobody is ever old enough to understand the love between a grandmother and a grandchild, or the things grown children do to their mothers, or the way a courtroom can save a family by refusing to break it the way it had been asked to. I'm 72. I don't know how many Sundays I have left. I plan to spend as many of them as I'm given, making jam with that boy and forgiving his mother by inches and being, as long as I am able, exactly what I have always been. His grandmother, hers too. Even now, even after everything, even still. I sat at my kitchen table the night after the hearing, with a cup of tea going cold in my hands, and I thought about cause and effect. About how every door we close on someone shapes the person they become, and how every door we leave open does the same thing. Wendy did not wake up one morning and decide to take her mother to court. That choice was built, brick by brick, over 30 years of resentments she never said out loud and they never asked about. I had been so busy surviving her childhood that I forgot to ask her what it had cost her. That was my part. I see it now. But Trent's part was something else. He saw a woman who had been hurt as a girl, and instead of helping her heal, he gave her a vocabulary for shutting people out. Boundaries, privacy, unsolicited contributions. Pretty words for a hard heart. And when you marry someone who teaches you how to wall off love, you eventually run out of people on your side. He moved out the week after the verdict. I cannot say I was surprised. Here is what I have come to believe, sitting on my back porch these mornings with my coffee. Character is not given to you. It is built, slowly, by the small choices nobody sees. The choice to answer the phone when a child is crying. The choice to tell the truth in a courtroom, even when your hands are shaking. The choice to forgive your daughter by inches, because all at once would be a lie, and a lie is no foundation for anything. I think a lot now about the difference between being right and being righteous. I was right about Beau. I was right to go to him, but if I had walked into that courtroom looking to humiliate my daughter, I would have lost something more important than the case. The judge could see who I was because I had decided, weeks before, who I wanted to be. That is the kind of strength you cannot fake. It comes from doing the quiet work nobody claps for. Eating breakfast when you do not want to, showing up for the people you love even when they have not earned it that day, refusing to be made small by someone else's smallness. To anyone listening who has been pushed out of a child's life by a child you raised, I want to say this: do not become bitter. Bitterness will eat the time you have left, but do not disappear either. There is a middle path, a hard one, where you keep your dignity and your door open at the same time. That is the path I am trying to walk. Some days I walk it well. Some days I sit on the porch and cry into my coffee. Both days count. We do not get to choose what our children do with the love we gave them. We only get to choose what we do next.